Hello everybody. Can I ask you to find your seats so we can get started? We also have an online component of this hybrid event, so we want to make sure people waiting at the screens know that we are starting. Welcome everybody. My name is Markus Fra. I'm the director of the Reich Institute, which hosts and sponsors this exciting talk. Just a few words, because I'm not sure that everybody knows what the Reich Institute is or does. We have been founded in 1955 as a research institute to preserve the history and culture of German-speaking Jewry. We've been doing this for almost 70 years, based in the collection, which we have here in New York, which is millions and millions of digitized pages of family collections and other documents, objects of art, historical documents, which are accessible to everybody who has an internet connection, and by public programs such as this one today. We are a proud partner of the Center for Jewish History, which is both the building and the institution in which we find ourselves, along with 4 other partners. We try to show the beauty, the tragedy, the relevance of Jewish history to a broad New York and beyond audience of educated people who are interested in that. And I'm very glad that you are part of this audience and that you are here today for this event. We're coming together here as a community of people who are both present and absent. The present ones is us, including our distinguished speaker, who I will introduce in a moment. But there are also people who are absent who create this community, and prominent among them are Mark and Lottie Sorten. You probably know Mark Sorten as one of the greatest coin collectors. The Sortens, Mark and Lottie, are very much in LBI's orbit. We have received support from the Sorten family, and we are very happy about their support in many ways. And one way in which we are happy about the supports that they bring. The topic about we are talking about today, that is numismatics and coins, which in my mind as a more traditional historian is an underrepresented and unsung field by which you can access history and Jewish history. So I'm particularly glad that thanks to the Sortens we are together for this event. Just a few words about the Sortens because they are part of this virtual community. Mark Sorten was born in Germany. His father, Felix Stressinger, was already a numismatist who had conducted auctions in Berlin. And through a very complicated, difficult journey of fleeing and then immigrating to the US, they arrived. He arrived in New York in 1946. Lottie Sorten survived the Holocaust, and she arrived in the United States in 1941. And the Sorten collection of coins is an important legacy of theirs. So my and LBI's gratitude and appreciation of the support of the Sortens is way bigger and deeper and more profound than at least my knowledge about numismatics and coins. So I'm very glad that we have a great expert on this topic, who I would like to introduce, Dr. Ira Rezak, emeritus professor of medicine at Stony Brook, who has long been interested in the topic of medals, in particular in their historical context and their social agency. He's a fellow of the American Numismatic Society and New York Academy of Medicine, a president of the Harry G. Friedman Society, which focuses on the art and history of Jewish material culture, of which coins are an important topic, and he's also a trustee of the Lottie Sorten estate. And he will speak to us today about Konrad Geldmacher. Frankly, I had not heard this name before I started looking into his life and work for this occasion. Sounds very exciting, and I hope we all look forward to your talk, which will be followed by a Q&A period, both for people present here and present online. And after all that, you are most welcome and invited to help yourself to a little refreshment, which is already set up in the back. Ira, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for coming, for attending virtually, and we all look forward to hearing what you tell us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I would just add that the Soldens were very good friends of my wife Brigitte and me, and their generosity has been shared widely in Jewish institutions, not just the LBI. Unfortunately. Art is a loaded word. Invoking it can automatically generate respect, for many of us have been conditioned to associate this term with things that are presumptively superior in taste. On the other hand, it may evoke, as it often does in me, a more skeptical reaction, because art is a highly subjective term. Who can precisely distinguish what is artistic from what is not? De gustibus non disputandum est. Medallic art suffers from an additional ambiguity. Historically, medals have not been seen as fine art at all, but rather a lesser decorative art category, therefore less prestigious than painting, or like furniture. The reason for this downgrade stems from the older technique of medal making, where the artist hand engraved a die, which then could be used to stamp or strike any number of medals. Such technical work was seen as a skilled craft rather than as an art in the aesthetic sense. In fact, the word art originally meant skill, as in the art of medicine, the art of diplomacy. And in those senses, it implies nothing about beauty or quality. There are, of course, other ways of looking at art, but I've offered this brief introduction because the man, Konrad Geldmacher, who I'd like to speak to you about today, was an artist who has hardly been recognized as such to the present day. I first learned of Geldmacher's existence about 25 years ago when a few medals, including that of Leo Beck, which you see, and also a mezuzah, which you see, appeared at a coin fair in New York. Prior to that time, I'd never heard of him. To get into our story a bit, neither had anyone else. He was a medalist unknown, though with obvious Jewish connection of some sort. As a collector of medals connected with Jewish history, for many years I was intrigued. Other medals of his appeared subsequently in the marketplace, dribs and drabs, some of them of Jews, some of them not. One thing was clear from the medals which bore his name. He gave his location as Berlin, and often dated the medals as early as 1946. I wondered who in Berlin could have been concerned with medal making 1 year after the end of World War II, with the city, indeed the entire country, in ruins. The catalogs, encyclopedias of art, the internet, had absolutely no information about Konrad Geldmacher. About 10 years later, an auction house in Leipzig offered a convolut, a mixed lot of documents and photos from the Nachlass, the estate of the Berlin artist, Konrad Geldmacher, and I managed to buy it, sight unseen. To my astonishment, it had 150 photos of Geldmacher's medals and sculptures, another 15 photos of the artist, his wife, and his friends, and a group of 15 original personal documents that located Geldmacher in time and place from World War I to the end of World War II. Biography is a big word that suggests volumes crammed with birth to death details of a person's life. Well, the reality in this case is more modest. I have been able to contact relatives of Geldmacher's wife and the son of his friends Herman and Ruth Becker, who had emigrated to America before World War II. I contacted several museums. I spent a week or so in Berlin archives, all of which has helped to define this man's personality, experience, and his art. But while the research over the past 20 years has certainly expanded Geldmacher's life story, many gaps, as you will see, remain in the telling. Konrad Josef Geldmacher was the son of Sophie Frank and Meyer Geldmacher, a Jewish merchant in Hanover, where Konrad was born in 1878. He had one sister who was a pediatric nurse and two others who died before World War II. His formal professional training began in the Kunstgewerbeschule, School of Applied Arts and Crafts in Hanover, after which, at age 21, he matriculated in 1899 at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste, the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Munich, with his specialty listed as sculpture, Bildhauerei. This academy, which was established in 1770, had by then become one of the foremost institutions for the training of artists in Europe. Among other well-known artists who graduated in this very period were Paul Klee, Franz Marc, Lesser Uri, and Vasily Kandinsky. Munich at this time provided a particularly contentious transitional artistic environment. The academy offered instruction in a wide range of traditional realistic styles, but by then included Impressionism. However, the Munich Secession, a group of visual artists opposed to these, had already withdrawn from this mainstream institution. And the Münchner Kunstgewerbeschule, the School of Applied Arts in Munich, offered yet another alternative training ground with an anti-traditional bent. This evolving mixture of styles and Geldmacher's training sequence are noteworthy because, though formally termed as a sculptor, throughout his life he was also a medalist, and thus bridges the territory between the fine and the decorative arts. The earliest reference to his work I found is actually this, in the Bayerische Kunstgewerbeverein's journal Kunst und Handwerk. It's a novel electric lamp cast in bronze featuring a nude figure. The accompanying commentary, written in the pompous jargon one sometimes sees in art criticism, grants that Geldmacher's metalwork shows fine craftsmanship, but says that the stone busts he also exhibited were a bit strange, differing from the preferred realistic painterly style, using concave mirror-like distortion. They were adjudged experimental but not uninteresting. That he experimented with cutting-edge decorative techniques is further evidenced by an undated set of desktop articles, including inkwells in this ultra-modern quasi-industrial style. Among his other early work is a metallic plaque and plaster of Eleonora Duse, the famous Italian actress and rival to Sarah Bernhardt. Here the artist exaggerates the actress's studio photo, which is anything but naturalistic in pose. The inscription on the reverse of this mounted plaque notes that the work is from Munich in 1906, but he dedicated it as a gift in the 1940s to his good friends the Beckers, about whom more later. A more conventional portrait dated 1914, presumably a private commission, is of a Jewish woman, Johanna Mosheim, 1855-1942. Geldmacher moved to Berlin before 1915, where he settled and was to be based for the remainder of his life. He was already 36 years old at the beginning of the First World War and was drafted in June 1916 at the age of 38. He achieved the rank of Unteroffizier, a corporal in the 34th Regiment of the Landesinfanterie, and he served on the Eastern Front, first in the Riegel district and later in the battle for Ukraine and during its later occupation by German forces. A medal of Lieutenant Dabelsheim, presumably an acquaintance or fellow officer, is dated 1918 and specifically states that it was sculpted in Ukraine. A similar piece of Major Paul von Westhoven is dated 1920. In February 1918, Geldmacher was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, a distinction, of course, but not a very rare one. For about 5 million such awards were made to every one of 3 soldiers who had served in the German army. He was discharged in 1919 and soon thereafter married Margareta Schumacher. Geldmacher's wife, whom he called Greta, was born in 1889, the daughter of a wealthy man of Finnish extraction who at one time had actually owned an entire apartment block in Berlin. Her mother was Polish. She had one married sister in Finland, later during the Second World War in Sweden, and another married sister in Hamburg. Konrad was deeply in love with his wife, as is obvious from the very large number of medallic and sculptural portraits he did of her. There are about 10 times this number that I'm showing you here. Margareta, in virtually all her photographs, presents herself modestly, almost invariably posing with a downward gaze, and many of her husband's medallic portraits of her also emphasize this characteristic. Konrad, on the other hand, usually posed himself boldly, often staring at the camera for photos, and also while portraying himself on medals. Exactly what Geldmacher did for a living between the First and Second World War is not entirely clear. He made medals and sculptures during this period that a review of museum inventories and commercial records show little evidence of acquisition of his works, either by institutions or collectors. On official documents, he was always designated an akademischer Bildhauer, an academic sculptor, yet the search of faculty listings so far has failed to find he was a professor of art at the university level. One has to wonder if he was perhaps a teacher of art privately or in a secondary school setting. In any case, there is evidence that he was a member of the Berlin Secession as of 1915, and he participated in the Great Berlin Art Exhibition of 1922. Few photos of the Geldmacher apartment between the wars suggest a modest standard of living. A small room filled with his own works is the major impression. Particular interest in one such photo, the photo on your right, is a small statue of a naked woman, which can be seen on the shelf behind this seated couple. This statue somehow survived World War II and was later gifted to his friends the Beckers after the war, and their son, Eugene Becker, donated the statue to the Jewish Museum in Berlin about 2008. Among the 150 or more photos preserved in the Konvolut, or else extant as actual specimens, of which I have about 40, the majority are medals, mostly made after the Second World War, but some from before the war as well. Both Jewish and non-Jewish contemporaries are represented in both groups, as well as some famous historical figures. Heinrich Löwe, for example, was a Jewish philosopher, a journalist, a librarian, a scholar, and the principal founder of Zionism in Germany, who had attended the First Zionist Congress of 1897. Geldmacher, as you see, recorded two versions of this portrait plaque, both dated 1927, one with and one without the Star of David. The reason for the creation of two distinct versions is unclear. Another portrait plaque from the interwar period is of Emil Brandt, which you see, a distinguished legal scholar and an author, which is undated but presumably from late 1920s as well, when that sitter was prominent. Though not far from each other in date, these two demonstrate a noteworthy difference in style. Brandt is crisply and flatteringly presented in formal costume in an unusual three-quarter perspective with an elegantly finished surface, while Löwe is rendered in a deliberately coarser, monumental aspect, as if the portrait was hewn from stone. A finely finished medal of Samuel Hahnemann, who had created the pseudo-scientific but very popular and still existing field of homeopathy, offers yet a third style, a deliberate simplification of facial features, perhaps bordering on the caricatural, but which manages to convey a sense of the subject's amazement. Geldmacher's treatment of Goethe presents yet a fourth approach, the combination of three phases of a person's life in one picture: youth, maturity, and old age within a singular portrait rendering. Geldmacher was reputed to be something of a bohemian, with many friends in the creative fields of decorative arts, theater, and music. Indeed, in many photographs not shown, taken of the artist, his beard, pipe in hand, defiant look, all reinforce this probably deliberate artistic impression. Several of the studies in his portfolio, unsurprisingly then, were portraits of such acquaintances and friends. Karl Langhammer, a landscape painter and magazine illustrator, based in Berlin, is one such example. Another is of August Becker, a very close friend of Geldmacher, whose son Hermann migrated to America in 1930, and who later tried to help Geldmacher leave Nazi Germany in 1938-1939. The film actor and stage actor Paul Wegener is a third. Wegener, whose career got its start with Max Reinhardt, was famous for playing Nathan der Weise, both before and after World War II, and also for creating a well-received silent-era film about the Golem of Prague. But Wegener was prominent in the state film industry during the Nazi period, right up to the very end of war in 1945. So it's quite remarkable to see two different studies of Wegener by Geldmacher, presumably his acquaintance or friend, both of them dated 1945. Emil Pottner was a Jewish artist who, like Geldmacher himself, trained in Munich, then moved to Berlin and worked in a variety of media. Undoubtedly an acquaintance and very likely, like Becker, a personal friend of Geldmacher's, this lively portrait, similar to the one of Hahnemann, was unquestionably done from life well before the war. Because Pottner's fate as a Jew involved loss of employment under the Nazis and ultimately deportation to Theresienstadt, then Treblinka, and death in 1942. Konrad Geldmacher himself was, of course, a Jew according to both Jewish and Nazi criteria. His matriculation notice at the Akademie in Munich in 1899 actually recorded his religion as Jewish, and he was listed as a member of the Jüdische Gemeinde in official records both in 1932 and again after the Second World War. That said, we know nothing about his personal commitment to Judaism or about his customary practice. But of course, he was married to a non-Jewish woman who had excellent Aryan credentials by Nazi criteria, and this was a fact that was going to be critical for Geldmacher's survival throughout the Nazi regime. On September 15th, 1935, his marital situation came under threat. The newly promulgated law for the protection of German blood and German honor was explicit in prohibiting cohabitation between Jews and Aryans in marriages, as well as in extramarital relationships. Posters in the Stürmer's characteristically crude, textual, and graphic style illustrate the concept of Rassenschande, racial defilement, that fundamental Nazi focus that by stages was to lead to the Holocaust. Full enforcement of this edict of September 15th did not begin immediately, but the implication that Aryans in mixed marriages ought, as loyal Germans, to demonstrate their patriotism by dissolving their mixed marriages was self-evident. Greta did no such thing. Konrad expressed his response to her loyalty in the form of a metallic plaque, which is dated September 19, 1935, just 4 days after the promulgation of the Nuremberg laws. Flourishing willow tree fills the space on one side of the plaque. On the other side, Geldmacher has inscribed his tender poem, comparing his wife to that tree and expressing his love and gratitude for her loyalty. It's worth quoting Geldmacher's actual words in translation, for they convey this essentially poetic spirit that he had, and some sense of the sustenance he gained from his relationship to a loving wife. Quote, "Small weeping willow, bent down to my little window, your long narrow branches bring comfort and hope. Sometimes tears run rainy and gray, but sparkling air again brings the sun, green and gold in the blue fragrance. I would smile more easily, were your visage always with me, in the face of fickle fate, end quote. Nine months later, in June 1936, Geldmacher received a letter from the Reich der Bildendes Künste, otherwise known as the Reich Kunstkammer, the organization subordinate to the propaganda ministry founded in 1933, charged with promoting Gleichhaltung, the coordination of arts with Nazi philosophy and goals. This letter informed Geldmacher in bureaucratic language, and without explicitly mentioning his Jewishness, that in accordance with the law of November 1933, he did not fulfill the requirements for membership in the Reich Kunstkammer. He was constantly expelled and consequently barred from further pursuing his profession as a sculptor. Obviously, this signaled to Geldmacher, as to other Jewish professionals, similarly deprived of their right to practice what they had been trained to do, that his sphere of employment was severely compromised. He must have felt rejected, disoriented, and perhaps depressed. Indeed, he was not even a well man at age 58. 2 years earlier, in 1934, he had been already hospitalized for 3 months because of a cardiac condition. In December 1938, the concept of privileged mixed marriages between Aryan and Jewish spouses became more precisely formalized, protecting the Jewish person from deportation until 1943, and exempting the Jewish partner from wearing the yellow star after it became mandatory for all Jews in 1941. In 1939, Geldmacher created one of the apparently only silver medals that has survived to this day. It honored his sister, Schwester Martha Geldmacher, a nurse in Hanover, who 3 years later was deported to Auschwitz and killed. A smaller medal labeled Always Remember also recalled Martha in 1950. As the Nazi noose gradually tightened, Konrad Geldmacher considered emigration. Part of the information for this period, 1938-39, derives from my contact with Eugene Becker, the son of Konrad's friends, Hermann and Ruth Becker. Hermann's father, August, who you see here, had died in 1932. He had been an actor and a particularly close friend of Konrad's. The couple moved to Brooklyn in 1930, and though affected by the economic depression, remained in contact with Konrad and proved eager to help him. The male Beckers, father and son, were non-Jewish, but Ruth was a Jew, and as you see, a subject of one of Geldmacher's portrait medals. A series of 10 letters sent by Konrad to Hermann and Ruth between 1938 and May 1939 document Konrad and Greta's hopes for a visa allowing immigration to America, England, or South America, and also expressing frustration on finding this to be impossible. I wonder if the director of the Leo Baeck Institute can read that letter.
Really? No.
I couldn't, and nobody could, until I found a graduate student in Stuttgart who was willing to transliterate all of this for me. They are all concerned, letter after letter, with the increasingly desperate desire to escape Germany. Geldmacher actually had well-to-do cousins living in California, and he appealed to them for help, but they turned him down. Hermann and Ruth Becker, on the other hand, made every effort to secure the desired visas for the Geldmachers, personally guaranteeing that he would not become economically dependent on public welfare if he reached America. But it was all to no avail, because as you all know, American State Department policy required that such guarantees had to be offered by blood relatives, so the visa application process failed. Letters in question were donated 15 or 20 years ago to the Berlin Jewish Museum by the Becker's son, Eugene. Geldmacher's Kenkarte, his identification pass, which is dated March 1939, of course incorporated the obligatory middle name of Israel and was stamped with a large J. He continued to describe him as an academic sculptor, though there is no evidence that he had functioned as such since his expulsion from the Reich Kunstkammer 3 years previously. Consistent with the Nazi policy for Jews and privileged marriages, by 1942, the then 64-year-old Konrad was compelled to work as a forced laborer in a variety of locations, all in an industrial area of central Berlin. Police permit issued in November 1942 expressly permitted him to use public transportation, and this was of course generally forbidden to Jews, who were by this time in any case routinely rounded up for expulsion and transferred to the east. His workbook lists 3 employers for the period October 1942 through April 1945. The exact nature of the duties he was forced to perform is unclear, but the businesses to which he was assigned are described respectively as a laboratory, factory for the manufacture of necessities, and an enterprise involving waste disposal. He was described as a Hilfsarbeiter, an auxiliary worker, the euphemism for a forced laborer. On 26th of February 1943, Goebbels ordered a roundup of those Jews, mostly workers in critical war industries, who were still allowed to live in Berlin. This infamous mass roundup preparatory to deportation to Auschwitz was known as the Fabrikaktion, the factory episode, and among those seized were the Jewish spouses, almost all males, in privileged mixed marriages, Konrad Geldmacher being among them. They were brought to a compound in the Rosenstrasse, located just a few blocks away from Gestapo headquarters in central Berlin. Famously, for a day or two thereafter, the Aryan wives, reportedly hundreds of them, repeatedly demonstrated in front of the compound protesting the seizure and deportation of their husbands. Amazingly, this response, apparently the only public protest against the deportation of Jews made during the Second World War, succeeded, and many of the prisoners were released. And this is a monument at the site currently. Geldmacher preserved the police document issued to him on March 18, 1943, granting him the right to return to his home in the Pragerstrasse, Wilmersdorf, to resume his use of public transportation, as we have seen, to continue to function as a laborer. It specified that this remission was based on his marriage to an Aryan wife, naming Margareta and recording her birthday as September 19, 1889. Soon after the Rosenstrasse event, the building in Pragerstrasse 17, where Geldmacher had lived for many decades, was destroyed by Allied bombs, and he was forced to live in a friend's dwelling in a closet, in fact, for a while, and thereafter in Sonnenallee, Neukölln. In June, Margareta visited her friend Inga in Hamburg, and a letter that Konrad wrote to her at that time actually survives. That Margareta herself survived is noteworthy, for only 1 month later, in July 1943, Hamburg, as you know, was bombed for 5 days and burned for even longer, causing about 40,000 deaths and nearly 200,000 injuries. Astonishingly, Geldmacher's workbook actually records the date of his last day at work, the day he was officially discharged from duty, as you can see, on April 30th, 1945, which was 1 day after Hitler's suicide, while the battle for Berlin still raged through the city. This entry, stamped and signed by his employer on that very day, is a remarkable testament to the emphasis on procedural order during the Third Reich, even under the most extraordinary circumstances. With the war over, Konrad Geldmacher found himself in the American zone of occupation. On August 3rd, he completed a Fragebogen, a questionnaire for the Jewish community. On this form, he reported details of his life and wartime experiences, described the bombing of his home in March 1943, asserted that he was homeless and without means of support, and also that in addition to his past cardiac condition, he had stomach ulcers and had lost weight. Of interest is that by this date, he already knew that his sister Martha had been deported in September 1942. It's also noteworthy that his handwriting in completing the Fragenbogen is decidedly more legible than it had been in the letters he'd written and passed on to the Beckers. Perhaps that earlier style of writing had been a deliberate attempt to baffle the censors. It's also remarkable that in the aftermath of the dislocations of war and the persecution he'd experienced for years, Geldmacher seems to have had the gumption to resume his medallic work almost immediately. A number of his medals are dated 1945 and 1946, prove this, and their subjects give us some sense of his situation and priorities in what was remaining a very disordered environment. Two opponents of Nazism were subjects of 1945 medals. One, Ketha Kollwitz, a distinguished artist and opponent of the war, who had been persecuted by the regime and died in 1945, is a well-known person. The other, Heinrich Gruber, a pastor of the anti-Nazi confessing church, had openly opposed the persecution of Jews, especially those who had converted to Christianity but were deported anyway on racial grounds. On the other hand, we've already seen that Paul Wegener, the actor of stage and screen, who had fully cooperated with Nazi film industry, was also the subject of Geldmacher's portraiture immediately in 1945, following the war. In March 1946, less than a year after the war's end, the newly established Kammer der Kunstschaffenden, the successor to the Nazi Reich Kunstkammer, wrote to Geldmacher recognizing his status as a prominent portrait medalist and without mentioning his former title as an academic sculptor, readmitted him to the formal world of artists. Of medals dating 1946, Geldmacher portrayed several American Jews stationed in Berlin at that time who were involved in relief efforts for the surviving German and refugee Jews. Rabbi Joseph Shalom Shubal was a Lithuanian-born chaplain in the U.S. Army. Geldmacher, as you see, made two, presumably contemporaneous medals of him, one in a style more deliberately stylized than the other, seemingly reflecting a modernist aspect associated with the Art Deco. This same emphatically angular style of representation is also seen on the other two portraits of members of the U.S. military who also worked for the American Joint Distribution Committee, Henry Levy and David Eisenberg. The latter, Eisenberg, was specifically charged with assuring kosher shechita. Geldmacher presumably interacted with the Joint to have known these individuals. Another portrait from this immediate post-war period is of Inga, the friend whom Greta had visited in Hamburg in 1943. But Geldmacher was also creating medals of historical figures in the 1946 period. These two views of Leibniz again show the artist trying different approaches to the same subject. We must wonder how Geldmacher managed to resume his medal making so soon after the war, when conditions in Berlin would hardly have been favorable. Possibly his relationship with the American Jewish individuals just mentioned played some role. Geldmacher's long letter to the Beckers in November 1948 sheds some light on the otherwise obscure period of the post-war period. He reports that from the time the war ended and for 2 years thereafter, he was able to work all day, though he doesn't say at what, and then model medals at night. He also reports that he had become personally depressed, was disappointed in others, especially with his wealthy relatives who had not come through with needed assistance, but also with various friends because of misunderstandings, and finally with the general political situation. He said that had Roosevelt only lived, things would have been better. He regretted the assassinations of Gandhi in India and of Count Bernadotte in Jerusalem. He referred to the tensions caused by the Russian Berlin blockade and was concerned that the situation might Positively, he noted that he had gained formal recognition as an Opfer des Faschismus, a victim of the Nazis, which meant that he now received a small pension. He looked forward to his 70th birthday, and he hoped that his friends might join him for the occasion. Over the next several years, Konrad resumed medal making, producing several portraits of personal friends, acquaintances such as a musician named Stella and a doctor named Dr. Koch. But above all, many studies of his wife, which you've already seen, and of the two of them together on their 30th wedding anniversary, 1949-1950, and also self-portraits, which he fashioned in order to give these to his friends on his 70th, 75th, and 80th birthdays. He also portrayed contemporary figures, such as Dr. Leo Beck on his 70th birthday, Pope Pius XII, Albert Schweitzer, Konrad Adenauer, Ernst Reuter, the mayor of Berlin. Many of these are known only from Geldmacher's photos of the models that he created. Of this latter group of contemporary figures, only the Leo Beck portrait is known as an actual finished medal in my collection. It bears repetition that throughout Geldmacher's long career, relatively few of the many medals he actually designed emerged as metallic medals, and few are known to have been sold in the marketplace during his lifetime. An unusual medal that Geldmacher made is this Erst wie du, he's like you, which shows the four races of man. Hope you can distinguish which race she intended. It's not a very artistic medal, but its heart is in the right place. There are actually two versions, as you can see on the left, one with the Indian's eyes open and the other with the Indian's eyes slit. I'm not sure why that distinction was made, but both are actually cast in metal. In 1953, the federal German government decided to honor Geldmacher, and in November of that year, he was formally presented with the Verdienstkreuz am Bande, the Cross of Merit on a ribbon of the Federal Republic. The recommendation for this award, which I found in the archives of the Foreign Affairs Department, noted his distinguished career as a medalist, specifically mentioning he had made medals of Adenauer, Heuss, and Reuter, also recognized his sufferings during the Nazi regime. 2 years after this award ceremony, his good friend, Walter Schliefhacker, died. Geldmacher was overwhelmed with emotion during his burial and spontaneous threw the Verdienstkreuz into the open grave, saying that his friend had deserved recognition more than he himself had. Geldmacher seems to have finally ceased his metallic work around 1958, when he was 80 years old. Greta passed away in February 1963, and in her memory, Konrad designed and published a small book entitled, with characteristic emotion and immodesty, Kleines Denkmal einer großen Liebe, small monument to a great love. Its 30 pages contain short poems, all by Geldmacher, and included a sculpture, a bust, and 20 different images of Greta on medals that Geldmacher had made of her over the years. Most of these had no doubt been modeled from life, but some few show her as a child and as a young woman, as Geldmacher imagined she might have looked before he actually knew her. The poetry is sentimental. The translation of the introductory text will convey the bereft husband's feelings. Quote, on February 27th, 1963, a precious human image left the earth forever, and the earth became the poorer. Margareta August Katharina Geldmacher, born Schumacher on September 19, 1889, was for nearly half a century my loyal life partner. She now has returned her lovely body, her noble spirit, and her beautiful soul to where she had received all this in order to make all whom she met happy. Here I set in her memory, in adoration and gratitude, a modest memorial in picture and word. Close quote. Konrad Geldmacher himself passed away 2 years later on January 26, 1963, at the advanced age of 87. He was buried by his wife's side in the Waldfriedhof Zehlendorf, a non-denominational cemetery. The announcement lists his wife's nephews and nieces, none of them then resident in Berlin. What can one say to summarize such a life? Geldmacher was born into a middle-class family during the prosperity of Wilhelmine Germany and died during the country's regeneration, the Wirtschaftswunder period of the Buddhist Republic. Between all of this, he pursued his art, he made many friends, he fought a war, he married, fortunately, felt abandoned by all but his wife during the Nazi ascendancy, but he still retained the drive in his late 60s and 70s to resume his career. He was a Jew who never denied his faith and suffered for it during the Nazi regime, and he was an artist who gained rather less recognition than he had hoped for in his lifetime. Why was that? The dissemination and appreciation of art seems to be a fickle process, dependent on patrons, promoters, critics, and collectors. As one interested in medals for many years, I've come to believe that at least in the limited field of medals, there are three general themes that animate collector interest. Geographic, people collect medals of their hometowns and their countries of origin. Thematic, people seek medals concerned with specific subjective interests, wars, medicine, air travel, railroads, Judaism, etc. And then there are collectors concerned primarily with the so-called art of the medal. So we come once again to the question of what art is, what criteria might be applied to define, or even more generally, to even characterize it, on which to base judgments as to originality or excellence. Needless to say, the answer to all these questions are culturally sensitive, highly subjective, mutable over time. Art history is replete with examples of popular styles and artists, and of their opposites, the fading of interests in the style or subject matter presented, and the failure of an individual artist to achieve critical or commercial success. How might Konrad Geldmacher's oeuvre appear in the light of such perspectives? It does not score well in the two relatively clear criteria for collectability of medals anyway, for his work contains nothing about geography or thematic focus. Geldmacher was fundamentally a portraitist, both in sculpture and medals, and portraiture is a difficult category of art to judge objectively. How can one without bias judge the authenticity of a subject's representation of his character, of identity, based on mere appearance? From a stylistic viewpoint, Geldmacher started his career in what might be termed an era of sculptural realism, impressionism, and after some brief ventures into modernist modes, settled into the mainstream of 20th century expressionism, using bold outlines, frontal projections to emphasize emotion. In this sense, this stylistic choice mirrored the man himself. For Konrad Geldmacher was by all accounts an emotional person who lived through very dramatic times and who faced the world boldly. While he failed to achieve fame, he inspired love and loyalty, and also, quite remarkably, he managed to survive the wars and persecutions that engulfed many of his German, Jewish contemporaries during the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe you want to stay at the podium for questions, both from the audience here and my colleague Monika Kuzma can signal and read questions that come in from the online audience.
Yes. I'm curious about the medium. It's so personal, those portraits. How are they used, and how would one earn a living from creating such things?
Well, as I tried to indicate, it's not clear at all that he made a living from his portrait medals or from anything. On one slide, I showed you a variety of other sculptural objects, including a tombstone for his mother, including a clock He made other small sculptures which he undoubtedly sold. There's no evidence that he made a penny from his medals.
How were they used? How were they used? Were they given to these people?
He certainly gave medals of himself on his 75th and 80th birthday, we know that. He undoubtedly gave or was commissioned to make medals of, say, bronze or Löwe, those fancy, and Mosheim. Those are probably commissions for which he was paid. But the vast majority of these medals exist only in photographs of which no medal is known in metal. I have been pursuing this for some time, and as I say, I have about 40 medals, but there are probably 100 or more in his photographic archive. So we know that he liked to make medals. Medals are cheaper to make than sculptures, to cast, and more convenient. And he liked the medium, but that he made a living, no.
Okay, thank you.
Dave,
You showed one mezuzah cover. I'm curious if there are others and if they're signed.
give me that again.
You showed a mezuzah cover,
Mezuzah cover.
and I wonder if it's signed and if there are other examples.
First of all, no. It's a unique example, known. The photograph was also in the archive, so we know it's by Geldmacher. It's not signed. And it says, and I tried to indicate that on the slide, it says Kehillah Kadosha Berlin. It's not clear to me whether it's before or after World War II, because it's in a style that I would judge to be possibly even Wilhelmine, traditional. So it's not clear to me when this was made. And I've consulted people who might have known in the community of Berlin, Hermann Simon, for example, and he is unaware of whether it's before or after the war. The example that I have is the only known example.
I'm also curious how he was actually able to mint these medals immediately post-war.
I don't know the answer to that. There are many holes in this story, as I indicated. Metal making, in a general way, consists of a sculptural model. If you're not engraving a die, and these are not the die struck, they're all cast, he would have made a plaster model. That model would have been given to somebody else, not himself. It would have been made into a mold and then bronze poured in. So the art is his work, the craft is somebody else's work.
But there were active foundries immediately
Oh,
post-war.
yeah, foundry is part of the industrial world. People are founding all kinds of things all the time. An engine block of a car is foundry. Okay, so there are lots of industrial things. I don't know where he did his work.
I think there was a question from the online audience.
Yes.
We have a question from Heidi online. She asks, what are the sizes of these medals? They look like coins.
Give me that again, please.
What are the sizes of these medals? They look like coins.
They're not the size of coins. They're approximately 2.5 inches for the round ones, and the big square one that he made for his wife is 4 by 4 inches.
It's like this, it's still so much.
Any more questions? Yes.
I'm just curious, he was clearly a very compulsive worker, and it is very, very unusual to see so many medals on FOSS. And I'm just wondering whether he was just working from photographs and just art for the sake of art, for keeping the practice, whatever it was, but he was not working, in medallic tradition, because normally the things that are always profile, or most of them are profile and on fasces, is really a very weird way of doing it. It's very unadvantageous to the sitter to be portrayed on FOSS. And
Well,
so
I
I'm
think
just
that there are
curious.
two issues, two separable issues. One, which you properly raised, is whether these were from life or from photographs. I can't answer that question. Because many of these people were his personal acquaintances, I have assumed, maybe wrongly, that he made them for life. I don't know that, okay? Number two, the facial projection rather than the profile projection. That is part of the characteristic of expressionism. He was an expressionist, and he was interested in direct confrontation. As you see, he presents himself that way. His life story definitely does that. And it turns out that in a general way, expressionist art is often in your face. It conveys more emotion than the neutrality of a profile view. Profile view, as you know, because you're a mental expert, is serene. It originates with Roman art, in which the idea of the serenity of the emperor is reassuring to everybody because he's looking off and will never be perturbed by anything. Geldmacher is reaching for the opposite. He wants to know that he's engaging and all these people are engaging.
I think we can end on a light note based on the final question, which was posted online, I think.
Yes, one more final question online from Alan. They asked, Konrad Geldmacher made several metal cats. Did he have a pet cat of his own? I know this is a trivial question, sorry.
Cat has a cat.
Alas, I'm unaware of facts, as in many cases.
Okay, on this fun note, I would say I want to thank, first of all, Ira. Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to our online audience, and with apologies to the online audience, I invite everybody to help themselves to some fruit and cookies and pastries at the back of the room. Thank you, everybody. If you're interested in what the Leo Baeck Institute does beyond lectures like this one, you can find us online. You can talk to Monica or myself, and we'd be happy to connect you if you're interested in German Jewish history and culture. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.